I think it's a good time to tell you a story about my dad. He was born in Italy, in Gubbio, in 1901. And his father was a mailman, and there were five siblings. And his father apparently was an alcoholic, and so they led a very difficult life. In their house, they had no heat, they had no water, and they had no electricity. And it was very difficult to find a living. And so by the time my father was 12 years old, he finished school and he started work. His work was with another farmer, and he would have to walk for 2 hours to get to the farm, work all day until the sunset, and then walk home in the dark once again. On the way home, he would have to steal a young tree, because there were no trees in Italy. They're all taken away. They've been used for energy because they don't have any coal there. At any rate, he would still cut down some young trees that the farmer would be upset about, and he'd take it home, and then they'd start a fire, and everybody would have to blow on that fire to try to keep it going so they could reheat polenta. Polenta, of course, is made out of corn, and it's like the cheapest meal they could have. And that's what they'd have for supper. And he told me if his shirt got dirty, then his mother washed it, he'd have to stay in the house because it was the only shirt he had. And when his mother washed it, she'd have to go down to the river to wash the shirt. So it was really a terrible life. He even saw his father try to beat up on his mother, and he'd have to separate them many times. And so when he was about 17 years old, World War I was over, and there was no more work for him. And they immediately started military conscription, and he was eligible. He said if he were drafted, his family was going to starve to death because he'd been the old support of them, because his father drank all the money away that he was earning, which was not much as a mailman. So a friend of his in America, in Old Forge, had written to him. He said, come here and you can work in the mines and make a good living. So he decided he wanted to do that, but he couldn't go because his passport would show that he would be too young and that he was needed for military conscription. His next door neighbor said, here, take my passport. So with that passport, my dad reluctantly left Italy, and with his little sack over his back, and got a train, went to France, worked in France after World War I, cleaning up, seeing all the horrors of what happens after a war. And then he also worked in the iron mines, and after 2 years he made enough money to come to America. When he came through Ellis Island, he came through with his friend's name. And so then he got on a train, and his friend met him in Duryea, Pennsylvania. And he lived in Old Forge on the same street all of the rest of his life. He worked in the coal mines for about 33 years. But Eugenio Panfili was a very intelligent guy, and he'd been in Italy for a few years before. And with himself and Eugenio, they learned how to read and write English based on the National Geographic and the New York Times. And of course, both of those were in our house all our lives when we were children. And it was a very enlightening ambience, period. Yeah. My dad worked in the mines then, and Eugenio, after several more years, decided he had made enough money and wanted to go back to Italy. And he had started a business of selling grape that he got from California, Zinfandel, to the Italian coal miners that made their own wine. And he decided he made enough money with that he could start a new store over in Italy. So he turned the business over to my father. And my father didn't know anything about winemaking, except over in Italy they used to jump on the grapes to make the wine. But over here in America they had the wine presses. The wine press is called torque. So at any rate, my dad took over the business, and he'd work as a coal miner 11 months of the year, and he would take off in September, and he'd get the orders from the coal miners, and he'd give the orders to the people, the sellers in California, and he'd get the Zinfandel, and it'd come in a grape box, and come in a train, refrigerated with ice, and then he'd hire somebody to deliver the grape, and then the coal miners would pay so much every month. He had a ledger, and then they'd finish paying by August. In August, they'd give the order for the next year. And then if they had any problems, they would ask him what the trouble was. So he wouldn't know. So what he did is he started making wine himself, and then if he or his customers had any problems, he'd get a gallon of their wine, and he'd get on the Greyhound bus, because they didn't have a car, and he'd go to New York City to the Milano Wine Institute, and they'd tell him what the problem was. And then he would be able to tell his customers how to make wine properly. And so he did it also, but he was not a drinker. So he sold a grape, just like some of the people sold a grape and ate the grape. But my dad was a connoisseur, but he never consumed any alcohol. So I remember what he would do. I helped him make the wine. He'd get the grapes and he'd crush it, and even my mom would. And then you'd see the fermentation. The carbon dioxide would bring the grape up to the top, and you have to push them down. And the fermentation, you could tell, was going on as long as the bubbles were forming. And when it stopped, then it was time to separate the skins from the wine. And then you poured that off, and then you got the grape skins, and put them into the torchio. And then you'd use that wine press, and you'd mix them together. And then you'd wait until that fermentation that clarified. In the barrel, there'd be a sedimentation, and usually by about Thanksgiving time, they'd start drinking their wine. It's very important to have a cellar that's not heated. And that would stay well without any problems for the rest of the year.